Welcome back, and welcome to our panel session, Research and Policy Challenges for a World with Drugs. I'm Karen Brock. I'm the Research Uptake and Policy Engagement Coordinator for Drugs and Disorder. I'm really delighted to introduce this panel, which has been a long time in the making, in a slightly different order from that shown on the slide. But we'll hear first from Maritza Paredes from the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, then from Romain Grandmaison from the Noria Research Project, then from Clemence Rusenga of the University of Bristol, and finally Francis Thomson from Drugs and Disorder and SOAS. In this session, we're widening our geographic horizon to hear from Peru, Southern Africa and Mexico about coca, cannabis and opium, respectively. I'd especially like to welcome other scholars to this session doing empirical research on drugs and development. This panel came about in response to an invitation from Drugs and Disorder to others in our networks doing the same kind of work. We knew that although we came from different disciplinary backgrounds, we all have a commitment to in-depth empirical research and an interest in challenging policy orthodoxies about the relationship between drugs and development based on the evidence that we're generating, and an interest in listening to the voices of those who are normally most marginalized in these debates, producers, consumers and traffickers from the global south. This invitation began a conversation during which the different research projects learned from each other and from our research, and reflected on how research might be used for policy engagement, and considered policy messages that we may have in common. So this panel that's about to start is the result of and the continuation of those conversations, which we hope will overflow and continue more in tomorrow's policy engagement learning workshop, which will include more people with different experiences of using research to influence policy around drugs, development, and peace building. Next slide, please. Sorry. First, we'll hear from Maritza, Clemence and Romain for about 10 minutes each, hearing about Peru, Southern Africa and Mexico. Then I'll share some policy messages that have emerged from our conversations about these projects and drugs and disorder. Francis will present some brief reflections from her perspective rooted in the drugs and disorder research. And hopefully, if it all runs smoothly to time like the last session did, we'll then have some substantial time for questions and answers. So, without further ado, I'd like to pass you over to Maritza to hear about her findings from research in Peru.
Thank you, Karen, and good morning. Thank you all for inviting us to share some of the results of our project, Regional Applicability of Innovative Crop Control Policy in the Andes. The aim of this project was to evaluate the applicability of Bolivia community-based coca control policy to Peru. We analyzed the different ways in which local actors link, resist, challenge, and collaborate with the state actions in the control of coca crops. And we want to point out also implications for public policy. For this presentation, because we have little time, I will focus on eradication and the management of violence, as well as the challenges for an integrated control policy for the case of Peru. First, I want to present the case of Peru as an intermediate case between Bolivia and Colombia. Why? Because it is the second largest coca producer in the Andes after Colombia, as shown in the graph in red. And coca cultivation has been increasing in the last 5 years by 50%. Peru is also an intermediate case concerning violence. There are low levels of lethal violence in comparison to other drug-producing countries such as Mexico or Colombia. And government carries out eradication manually. There is no use of aerial fumigation. Still, eradication produces significant violence among families and communities. Also, the coca leaf is not openly criminalized. There is a legal tiny coca market, which is monopolized by the state, but more close to 90% goes to the illegal illicit market. Also, I wanted to show how coca crops are widespread in 14 valleys across the territory with different production, profitability, and violence levels. So it's very complicated in terms of the expansion. But the largest concentration of crops is in the brine, in red here in the circle, with 48% of cultivation. And this is the area where our project was carrying out most of the empirical research. We were surprised by the calm environment in the brine. We also were surprised about the strong presence of the state on both legal and illegal markets in the area, especially in the central city, Pichari. And at the same time, we realize that there has been a very heterogeneous implementation of eradication policy at the subnational level, as you can see in the graph. These are the different or the most important valleys. And the brine has almost not been eradicated during all this period. So we understood and we learned that the government tried many times to do eradication in the area, but eradication was suspended because was stopped by the forces and organizations in the brine, farmers' organizations. So having this information, we want to understand what is behind this kind of order and in what context and with what resources social actors negotiate the scope of control policies such as eradication. We learned that unlike Bolivia, social actors in Peru do not have the power to challenge national drug control policies. But in the brine, they do have some levels of organization and symbolic capital, that is what I'm going to explain, to exercise pressure to suspend eradication at the local level. And here, I want to say that war has no linear consequence. Coca growers in the brine contribute with the Peruvian army to fight the Chinese Path, the insurgent group who initiated an internal war in Peru for more than a decade. As a result, they succeed in being part of the pacification process, using their coca resources for arms, logistics, and others. In contrast, we learn also that in the Alto Guayaga in the north, where the Chinese Path, the insurgents, had more social control, their organizations and leaders were more easily criminalized and stigmatized by police forces when they attempt forced eradication. In the brine, the historical role of coca growers in the pacification has also contributed to today Cocaleros organization significant role in local security, ensuring that violence is controlled. That's why we see a very peaceful and calm area, but with focus of strategic and specific actions of violence. However, suspension of eradication only mitigates social conflict escalation, but do not provide long-term solutions, as eradication is always seen by farmers as a threat. And the historical distrust of the state and its agencies and the legal organization development outside the brine made this control violence very fragile. Moreover, we wanted to say, and I go here, there is an expansion of the coca frontier to new areas, which is challenging this control violence in the brine. In the 60s, looking to push the agricultural frontier, the state mobilized and abandoned thousands of Andean peasants in the tropical forest. They were migrants. They were called colonos in this forest and tropical area. And they became coca growers at the end of the 60s. You can see the picture of a colono coca grower here. Very different than today's new actors in this market. Today, the cocaine illegal market expands beyond these migrant lands, reaching new areas where original Amazonian indigenous people, like this Ashaninka woman, live, and where the native forests, important for the world climate crisis today, where the country wants to do extensive conservation, still stand. So related to what was mentioned yesterday in the opening session, in these margins of the tropical forests in the Amazon of Peru, other forms of violence different than war take place. Mining, logging, sport agriculture promote violent deforestation and land use modification. As you can see in the graph here, the one in the left, deforestation has tripled along the last 20 years, but it has escalated very rapidly in the last 5 years. So yes, Andean migrant settlers rent plots in Amazonian indigenous lands and exercise pressure, sometimes more than gentle pressure, to use their lands. But also, because increasing deforestation, instead of hunting and gathering, indigenous Amazonians sell more of their workforce and also became small-scale farmers of cocas. Coca crops are also a livelihood strategy for Amazonian indigenous to respond to these socio-ecological transformations. Graph on the right shows how coca cultivation increased among indigenous Amazonian communities in the last years. So, yes, they are affected by the expansion, victims of the expansion of coca driven by migrant settlers, but they are also part of this expansion. So there is no easy villain and hero game here. It is not simple, and the simplicity creates dangerous divisions between them. There is also a huge discussion among them about how to be part of these markets and the consequences. They have started experience the attempt of foreign actors, drug dealers, but also state authorities to intervene in community decisions. And moreover, foreigners want to hold their titles, land titles, with the help of corrupted officials. And they are losing the forests on which their lives and cultures depend on, and their constant interaction and attempt of the state without a human security strategy is putting their lives in risk, as the rest see them as cooperating with the government. So in this context, we have 3 lines very fast of recommendations. We think in terms of dialogue, it's important to increase the participation of various coca growers organizations, including women organizations and indigenous organizations. Also, consider proposals to gradually reduce coca crops from organizations instead of prioritizing eradication or only suspension. Suspension is not a solution. In terms of violence prevention, we find that it's useful to prioritize the territorial and human security of Amazonian communities, avoid the victimization of Amazonian indigenous communities and the stigmatization of Andean indigenous migrants or colonos concerning drug trafficking, because it creates conflict and very dangerous and a dangerous violent situation for the future. It is important to address the corruption of state officials who enable access to land titles for invaders of indigenous territories, and will be very helpful also to reduce the cost of community resilience with effective protection system for the forests, like basic tools, drones, GPS, internet connections, so they can get in contact with authorities when they feel in danger. But also overall, and I'm finishing with this, sorry, Karen, I needed 1 minute more. I think it's necessary to acknowledge the limits of a focus only on export agriculture, because export agriculture is also producing deforestation and is entering in this vicious circle of dependence, and is insecure policy solution for families. And it's important also to improve the coordination of different state policies, not only export-oriented policies, but emphasis in land tenure, environment, infrastructure, education, security, and mainly of all market access. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maritza. It was very much worth the extra minute to hear your recommendations there. Thank you so much. We're going to move now from Peru to Mexico and bring in Romain, who does not have, I don't think, has a PowerPoint, and will just be speaking to us about the findings and implications of the Noria research project in Mexico. Over to you, Romain.
Thanks so much, Karen. Thanks so much for inviting me and having me in such an amazing lineup of events and conferences these days. I'm, as you said, I'm going to present on Mexico and on opium, heroin, and the markets that tie basically Mexico to the United States. The project and what I'm presenting today is called the Mexico Opium Project, and you can find it on Noria research page on the Mexico and Central America program, but also on our allies that worked with us in a project that started almost 3 years ago and kind of finished or posed last year. So what I'm presenting today is a very collective project of research that started with two considerations that were both connected to research, academic research, fieldwork research, and policy questions. The first one was almost 4 to 5 years ago. We were doing fieldwork in different regions of Mexico, producing opium that is transformed into heroin and exported to the US. We were doing fieldwork, and the farmers started telling us that actually the prices of the opium in Mexico was falling down. In the following month and years, the price actually crashed to a level that made it not profitable anymore for farmers to actually grow opium and sell it to traffickers able to transform it to heroin. And we were observing an amazing decrease of cultivation of opium in Mexico. So we kind of framed it as the opium crisis in Mexico that was apparently directly tied to the boom of fentanyl use in the US. And the second one was, in terms of research and policy again, the second observation that sparked this collective project was that Mexico has been producing heroin for the past 70, 80 years. It's been the first provider of heroin to the US for the past 30 years, at least. It's in the top producers of opium and heroin, therefore, of the world, competing in that sense with Myanmar in the second, third place after Afghanistan. And yet, Mexico is usually, and mostly, and it's still the case actually, absent from the projects, the literature, the policy analysis that work on illicit drug production and its relationship with development studies, security studies, policy studies, and drugs policy today. So what we wanted to do was actually to gather a team of researchers, do field work in regions in Mexico that produce opium and heroin. And what's amazingly interesting about the regions that do produce opium in Mexico is that they have been historically the same regions that have been militarized and targeted by the war on drugs. And this is not recent. We're talking again like 50, 60, 70 years, the first military operations against opium production in Mexico, in Sinaloa, the state of Sinaloa, what's called, and that's funny because I think it connects to so many other presentations in those days, the region that gathers Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua in the northern part of Mexico is called the Golden Triangle as well. So what we have been working on for almost 2 years is one qualitative aspect of the research was doing field work in order to pursue a small corpus of literature that was trying to document in Mexico from the ground what was the reality of opium production, how many people, were involved in opium production in Mexico, how it works, how it connects to marginalization, to margins, borderlands, as you were presenting today in another event, how it connects to the legal economies, how it connects to the legal market, and of course, how it connects to drug trafficking, drug cartels activity, and the connection Mexico and the privilege connection Mexico has with the first drug consumption market in the world, which is the US, and which is actually like 2,000-3,000 kilometers away, sometimes less if you're in Sinaloa and Chihuahua. We wanted to document the contradictions, the reality of opium production in Mexico, try to understand why it's absent from not only the international debates on illicit drug production, but also from the national political debate in Mexico. Like, opium production, again, is an historic phenomenon in Mexico. It doesn't have traditional roots like coca, for example, in Bolivia or Peru, but it has an historical connection to the way the state has been building power and authority, and that's of course an argument that connects very much with the drugs and disorder project. At the same time, and although the Mexican government has been eradicating by land or by aerial fumigation the cultivation of opium and marijuana, for that matter, for almost 70 years, with non-stop military campaigns against those production, it's not a public problem in Mexico. It's not something that makes headlines. It's not a topic that is central to political campaigns, for example, and elections. It's a very, very routine military security policy activity for the government to eradicate. It's something that the Mexican government, again, has been doing for decades. And at the same time, it's part of the military security strategy that we see in blatant terms in the past 15 to 20 years. So basically what we wanted to document are those contradictions. And we also wanted to do it in quantitative terms. So we had a team working in that case from an NGO called Mexicans United Against Delinquents in Mexico, México Unido contra la Delincuencia. And the research team there, led by Paul Frisard Martinez in Mexico, was trying to work on data, trying to work on the data we have on eradication in Mexico, on drug seizures in Mexico. And it's very hard, actually, although UNODC has a program with the Mexican Marine Corps to monitor the production of illicit crops and opium in Mexico. It's very hard to make it blatant and documented, the connection between field, what's going on in reality in a constant process, of course, and how do we measure the number of hectares produced and cultivated in Mexico, the number of hectares eradicated in Mexico. The problem is that basically the figures we usually have are 1 to 2 years delayed if you compare it to what's going on the ground, which in terms of research and policy basically makes it an amazing gap between an opium crisis, for example, that is evolving as we speak, and the moment where the issue actually makes it to headlines. So what we wanted to do was to combine this qualitative and quantitative research and show how important is opium production in Mexico in, again, like the most emblematic regions of the war on drugs. And I will finish on this, and we can discuss the precise, I think, results of the research and so many questions in the Q&A. But what's interesting, and I will be very honest about it, one part of the project was, of course, to raise awareness and policy awareness about what's going on in Mexico in terms of illicit drugs. And I think we failed, actually, at provoking an impact that actually brings Mexico to the international table, that brings opium production to the Mexican political debate in general, I think we probably failed because of the way we have been communicating, but also because for some reason, and it's very interesting, I think, to see that way, Mexico is still absent from those discussions at the international level. And I think we have to work more to actually bring it to the table, as again, it is Mexico, it's drug trafficking, and it is directly connected to the US market, which makes it an amazing territory for research, for policy research, and for political analysis, I think. And I will leave it to you, Karen, and I will take, of course, happily all the questions in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. That's great, and it's a good reminder to everyone to please start putting your questions in the Q&A. As I said at the start, as long as we do run to time, we have left time to do that. So looking forward to questions for all of our panelists at the end of the presentations. We're now turning to Southern Africa, to Clemence Rusenga from the University of Bristol. Welcome, and I will hand the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you everyone for having me here. My name is Clemence Rusenga. I'm presenting a paper titled Cannabis, Agrarian Change and the Crisis, Contested Livelihoods in Southern Africa, which I'm co-authoring. I'm working on this paper together with Gernot Klashnik, New Career, and Simon Howell. Next slide, please. So this paper is speaking to the work that we are doing in a project called Cannabis Africana, Drugs and Development in Africa. The project is focusing on the nexus between drugs and development in Africa, and the aim to offer a foundation for devising better policy towards cannabis and other drugs in Africa and beyond. The project has four main objectives that we are seeking to explore. One being to provide an historical account of cannabis in sub-Saharan Africa. Two, to understand the contemporary place, purpose, and perceived utility of cannabis in sub-Saharan Africa. To explore the varied cultures of consumption around cannabis in four select sub-Saharan countries. And lastly, to assess the impact of drug policy on cannabis production, distribution, and use. It's important for me to note that at this stage that this project is still at its formative stages. So we are planning, we have just begun data collection, and we are looking forward to collecting more data. Next slide, please. I think it is important at this stage to highlight an important context here, that cannabis has a long history in Africa, but it remains illegal in many African countries. We also note the deteriorating legal, agrarian, and non-agricultural livelihoods, which make cannabis an option for some. So, and when we say an option, it doesn't mean that people are beginning to turn to cannabis at this stage, but some have been, cannabis have been playing a role in other people's livelihoods, but given the deteriorating economic situation, so we are seeing an uptake by some, but the role of cannabis to livelihoods remains under-researched in Africa. Next, please. It is also important to note at this stage that these developments are taking place at a time when we are also witnessing the emergence of a legal worldwide cannabis industry, which has been projected, which was estimated to be around $30 billion in 2021, but projected to grow to around 200 billion in 2028 by Fortune Business Insights. And against this background, some countries in Africa began to take some measures, especially to legalize cannabis for medical, scientific, and industrial purposes. And on the second bullet point there, I have indicated a number of countries, and as you will see, most of them are from Southern Africa. Can we move to the next one? And this, for our project, we are specifically looking at four countries, which is Kenya and Nigeria, where cannabis remains illegal, but there are debates around legalization. And then the third country, Zimbabwe, you have a dualization kind of in terms of the legal status, where cannabis for medical and scientific purposes has been legalized since 2018, while unlicensed production for personal trade and consumption, which is the domain for many smallholders, it remains illegal. In South Africa as well, you have cannabis for medical and scientific purposes being legal, also private production for personal consumption and for adults only. It is illegal, but unlicensed production for trade purposes or commercial purposes, which is the domain for many smallholders, it remains illegal. Next slide, please. So in the context of this emerging legal cannabis industry, there are some observations that we are beginning to see in Southern Africa. And one of those is that what we are seeing from what the manner the regulations are structured, and also the industry, the manner in which it is shaping up. You see that big agribusinesses, including international ones, are the major beneficiaries, in that the licenses that are issued to producers are mainly or predominantly or solely issued to agribusinesses, except for Lesotho, where they try to offer for free for smallholders, but who fail to produce anyway. So the license fees are not affordable for many smallholder producers. If you look at the license fees on point number 3 there, you will find that they are not small monies that many can afford. Structurally, also, small producers are unable to satisfy many other conditions for producing for medical and scientific purposes. In other words, you can call this the standards that are in the industry that they are required to satisfy in addition to gaining the license. So they are not able to do that. Next slide, please. So what are the implications that we are beginning to see, or the implications that this raises, especially in the manner in which the developments are taking place in Southern Africa? We are seeing corporate capture of the cannabis industry, or the risk of corporate capture of the cannabis industry, an industry or a sector that has long been the domain for small producers. With that comes the exclusion of small producers from the legal market or sector through prohibitive structural and legal requirements. We are seeing also the dualization of a model, an emergence of a dual model or agrarian structure in the cannabis sector, where on one hand you have a legal market and the benefits which are mostly reserved or available or accessible to agribusiness, while on the other hand you have the continued decriminalization of production, trade, and consumption by the marginalized. And with that, also it comes with the implications for cannabis and violence, where because of this dualization, many smallholders who for long have been victims of the laws that are there that ban their production. So they continue to be recipients of state violence through arrests and long jail terms, even for small producers, through arrests and long jail terms, even for small amounts. So we're seeing the continuity of colonial legal frameworks punishing cannabis producers, or traders and consumers, especially the small one. Next slide, please. Next. Thank you so much. So looking at this, there are some key questions, and which in other ways also present some challenges ahead, not for our project, but not only for our project, but even in the context of Africa and Southern Africa, where this is taking place, these new developments are taking place. And these key questions, number one, we are saying, how do we make the industry inclusive and beneficial for smallholder producers or the marginalized? And in addition to that, what role can the poor producers play in shaping the policy framework for the emerging industry to make it inclusive and contribute to their lives? Because what we are seeing is at the policy roundtable, you find the big companies that are there, And lastly, what are the implications of current changes in cannabis regulation for agrarian reform, transformation in Southern Africa and Africa in general? And last slide, please. For more information, you can check us on the, we are on Twitter. We also have a blog. We also have a Facebook page that you can check also there. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I've just realised that I've been muted, haven't I? So I say again, thank you to Clemence. That was great. Really good to hear from another continent about another drug. Really interesting findings. I'm hoping, Mikey, that you can show the slide with common messages. Yes, thank you very much. So, as I said in my introduction to this panel, the conversations between the researchers on the projects that we've just been hearing about also discuss some common overarching findings and messages for policy and practice. So this slide is stepping back a bit from the details of the research that we've just been hearing about from our three panelists. And I'm now sharing these as a collective contribution to the discussion. So we start with two overarching findings, really. The first, that development interventions can themselves generate poverty, exclusion and insecurity, creating new pathways into drug production, trade and use. I think across all of the projects that are on this panel, there's ample evidence of this. The way that poor households engage with illicit drugs may be in part a response to the very processes of market-led rural development that many policymakers claim will alleviate poverty. So there's a need to reconfigure drug and development policies so that they make a sustained contribution to the lives of the rural poor in drug-producing regions. And I think this is the kind of paradigmatic shift that Jenny was talking about yesterday in her response to Jonathan's keynote presentation. Our second overarching observation is that drugs can provide a safety net and be a medium for addressing inequality and exclusion. So in the drugs and disorder research in Afghanistan and Colombia and Myanmar, our research found many, many examples of the sustained benefits to poor households of cultivating coca or opium, including employment and access to credit, despite the risks associated with illegality. In many places, cultivating coca or opium provides more sustained benefits to poor households than official poverty alleviation programs or public services. And in some places, as Adam Payne's presentation in the Afghanistan session yesterday highlighted so clearly, opium is the last chance to stay on the land. What does this imply? I think it implies a continual need to use research to keep drugs on the table and in the view of those who make and implement humanitarian and development interventions. Now we come, having had a couple of overarching findings, we now move to three messages that we think come from across the projects. The first is, don't criminalize farmers or eradicate illicit crops by force. There's so much evidence that eradication stokes violence, destroys the livelihoods and lives of the most vulnerable, increases the profits of the wealthy and most protected, and generates resentment towards the state, making peace and state building difficult. So our research adds more evidence to what is already known about the effects of eradication. But it also tells us some things about what smallholders need if they're to be supported to substitute their illicit crops. Buyers for legal produce at stable, decent prices, alternative livelihoods in place prior to voluntary eradication, a gradual approach to substitution, and the provision of basic public goods and services, including security, healthcare, education, and social insurance. A second message, and I think I heard a lot about this in the three presentations today, approaching drugs policy with the reduction of violence in mind, developing tools to consider the effect of how different types of violence are associated with drugs and how to reduce them. Again, this speaks to what Jenny was saying yesterday about putting violence is plural, at the centre of a conversational reset. And it's also about the different kinds of violence, as Maritza talked about in her presentation just now. Our challenge here is on the one hand to consider how best to use evidence to develop tools and strategies for reducing violence. But on the other, it's also about actively monitoring how policies play out, sometimes even generating different forms of violence, and which groups are most likely to be affected by that. Finally, a message on focusing on reducing inequality, including addressing gender issues. So I think our research findings, in common with many others, question the continuation of a securitized prohibitionist drug policy agenda. Interventions that focus on reducing illicit drug supply in fragile and conflict-affected states are reinforcing the inequalities associated with drug economies. By targeting the poor, they can increase destitution at the bottom of the drugs commodity chain. By increasing the risk premium associated with drugs, they increase the profits for those who are further up the drugs production chain. But our findings, I think, also suggest that an alternative agenda suggested by a rapid and blanket legalization of drugs would have a devastating impact on the economies of countries like Afghanistan and Myanmar, where thousands of livelihoods depend on the markup associated with illegality. And also, as Clemence's presentation showed, the dangers of the risk of corporate capture of the cannabis market for smallholders in Southern Africa are substantial. So I think what we see is that neither a drug-free world nor the blanket legalization of drug markets constitutes a realistic or viable solution to the drug problem. In the short to medium term, we think there's a need for smarter, more strategic and pragmatic approaches which are less about a drugs-free world than a world where the balance of who wins and who loses from the drugs trade is less unequal. On that note, I'm going to hand over to Frances for some responses to some of what she's heard on the panel today. So over to you, Frances.
Thank you, Karen. And also just want to reiterate thanks and compliments to the presenters. So the presentations are packed with a lot of interesting insights, but I'm just going to focus on 3 themes, which very much speak actually to what Karen just mentioned. So the first is crises. All 3 projects, it seems to me, point to the role of livelihoods crises in the growth of illicit drug crop economies and how particular development models contributed to producing these crises. Maritza's presentation referred to the livelihood crises faced by indigenous Amazonians in Peru who turned to coca cultivation in the wake of forest loss caused by market-driven extractivism, as she called it. Clemence spoke of deteriorating legal livelihoods in Southern Africa and how this contributed to the expansion of cannabis cultivation. And I know that Romain didn't mention this, I don't think, in his presentation today, but having looked at Noria's research, I know that there's been a lot of mention of the reforms imposed in Mexico from the 1980s onwards, and how these reforms, which favored export-oriented agribusiness, contributed to social and economic crises in certain regions of Mexico while benefiting others. And in those marginalized regions, opium poppy expanded in response. This is also a theme that's clearly echoed in the first 2 policy messages that Karen presented and has come up repeatedly in the drugs and disorder research as well. So the second theme is fragility. We're reminded by the presenters that the new livelihoods that people have built within the drug economy are themselves fragile and subject to crises. So put another way, the safety net that Karen mentioned is not fail-safe. Romain's and the Noria Mexico team's research on how the rising popularity of synthetic opiates and fentanyl, specifically in the United States, has devastated poppy producers in Mexico gives a strong sense of the fragility of these illicit livelihoods and how the sectors that have provided refuge in crisis contexts can themselves become sites of crisis. Clemence's presentation also communicated the fragility of illicit livelihoods. He referred to corporate capture that is already happening within the medicinal cannabis sector, but I also see his presentation as a forewarning of the battles ahead world over. And I think Clemence itself may have suggested that as legalization of cannabis for recreational purposes proliferates, unless there's strong action to prevent it, we're likely to see corporate capture in this sector too. And this would obviously imply enormous loss for marginalized farmers. The license fees are shocking that Clemence presented, but as Clemence himself emphasized, this isn't the only barrier. There are also regulatory barriers, which are likely to be higher for medicinal cannabis, but will no doubt be imposed on recreational cannabis as well in a legalized framework. And I think those of us who are in favor of promoting the growth of legal coca markets, which is something Maritza mentioned, will have a lot to learn from the experiences with cannabis legalization and that risk of corporate capture that comes with it. So Maritza referred to different kinds of fragilities and risks, but those, I think, as I understood it, that the indigenous Amazonians specifically are facing as a result of land loss, environmental degradation, and increased conflict and violence. So if I understand correctly, the indigenous Amazonians adopted coca cultivation in response to livelihood crises created by extractivism, but then even their adapted or new livelihoods are fragile due to the continued extractivist push, mining and logging and things like that in their territories. And finally, the third theme is state violence, especially that linked with criminalization. All three projects point to the centrality of state violence, and this is something that cannot be taken for granted in the study of illicit drug economies, which are often assumed to be violent because of criminal actors' involvement in them rather than because of their criminalization by the state. I thought the hypocrisy of it all seems to be particularly acute in the case of cannabis, as Clemence emphasized, with a situation where agribusinesses are being encouraged to produce the same crop that smallholders are thrown in jail for growing. In the case of Peru and Mexico, as Maritza, Romain, and their colleagues have pointed out, forced eradication of illicit crops is itself a form of violence that is often also associated with physical violence. So again, going back to the theme of the multiple forms of violence, this violence is then justified using discourses of criminalization. And I was particularly intrigued by Maritza's study of negotiated pacification, as it illustrates so clearly the politics of criminalization, how criminalization can be applied partially or selectively. It also exemplifies, I think, at a local level, what Jonathan was speaking about yesterday in his keynote, the drugs policy trilemma. More broadly, I think the research you're all doing resonates with the work we've been doing in drugs and disorder, and I'm sure I speak for others when I say that I look forward to engaging more with your research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis. Really well done to pull those three key points together. What I'd like now is if the panel are able to join me on the stage. We do have some questions. And the first one I'd like is a question for Maritza. Thanks you very much for the interesting presentation, with which I concur. You mentioned that it's necessary to explore different alternatives to agriculture, since it also enhances deforestation. Which livelihoods or approaches different to agriculture do you think are feasible for a context like the one you were speaking about?
Thank you, Karen. I think also depends which kind of agriculture is promoted, because I think the focus on plantations and other kind of agricultural commodities do not necessarily resolve the day-to-day livelihoods of families. Like, they are very the prices are volatile, and also until they reach the capacity to export, they don't have the means to reproduce their lives. But on the other hand, this kind of agriculture is also damaging of the forests where they live, and and the environment. So it's a vicious circle. And it's also a kind of agriculture that is very needy of land. So you get state officers getting into corruption to change the use of land and to hold for foreigners indigenous land titles sometimes. So it has different kind of problems. And I think one thing that has not been in the plate, in the agenda, is how to promote local markets for agriculture, like a more small agriculture that can be less damaging, but that implies national policy and change the focus in exports and to also promote local markets and to improve agricultural policy that has been in Peru for many years a very liberalized policy. So you don't protect any kind of crops. You have very little investment in technology, and probably the Ministry of Agriculture is one of the weakest ministries in the state. So there is a need of change in the frame of the macro policy and see agriculture as playing not only a role in terms of general development, but also in trying to fight against drugs, especially in areas where you need to compete with coca with other kind of forms and other type of less damaging agriculture.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take now, we have a question for Romain about opium in Mexico. Whether you see the downtrend in opium cultivation in Mexico as a permanent phenomenon or a crop that may expand again in the future.
It's really interesting because what we have been witnessing in the past 5 years is a situation that the farmers were telling us no one saw coming. Basically, for them, opium production for the past at least 30 years was always growing, always giving more money somehow, and so many other problems, of course. But it was a constant source of benefit, and it was a very, very stable one. For the past 5 years, basically what we see is a very, very fluctuative market. And it's something that is very new in Mexico for opium production. And that is, of course, extremely challenging for those depending on opium economy. What we see also, and I think it's what makes Mexico so interesting in those questions, is the level of embeddedness of the Mexican production areas and market with the demand and the consumption in the US. Again, like we are 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 kilometers away max, right, from the first buyer, the first client. So what we were trying, and I think it's something that is still extremely open for research, we were trying to disentangle how much of demand and offer rules work in the Mexico-US drug supply market, basically, in consumption market. And opium is very interesting in that sense, because it allows, although it's very hard to actually get to the grip of the offer and demand mechanisms, of course, but it allows to observe fluctuation 2-3 times a year, since opium is cultivated through 2 or 3 seasons of production in Mexico. So we see fluctuation in prices from one season to the other, fluctuation in who's harvesting from one season to the other, which basically is 4 months to 4 months. So the level of fluctuation right now is extremely high. And of course, it's extremely interesting to see how much it connects with the new trends in opioid consumption in the US and the synthetic mix, basically, that is kind of not, we don't know if it's taking over, but it's basically creating a new competitive market in which those farmers basically have absolutely no advantage, no added value, and no possibility to engage whatsoever.
Thank you very much for that really thorough answer. Clemence, we've got a couple of questions for you. Could I pose these? Is there forced eradication of cannabis in the countries that you're working in? That's the first one. And whether the development of the medicinal and scientific cannabis market impacted demand for smallholder grown cannabis.
Okay, thank you so much. So with regard to forced eradication, so the picture in Southern Africa is that although cannabis is illegal, it's the state doesn't like preoccupy itself that much with the enforcing that. So you will see these episodes of forced eradication. That is, if they get the information that someone is producing, yes, they can come and arrest the person or also go to destroy those fields. But we don't only, for example, in Lesotho, that's where you will find, for example, let's say 1 hectare, someone producing 1 hectare of cannabis. But the research that we are getting so far, especially with Lesotho, is that yes, the state wants to, and the state security officers, they want to eradicate those fields, but there's a lot of, I think, number one, the state doesn't have the capacity to implement. Though they say that cannabis is illegal, but it doesn't have the capacity to preoccupy itself primarily with eradicating. So they will come and eradicate here and there, but it's not something in a systematic manner. There's no logical approach to it. It's only so sometimes they don't even eradicate because of corruption that takes place. If money exchange hands, and then you find that someone who would have supposed to be arrested, they will be just let go. So eradication, yes, is there, but not implemented systematically. And then number two, with regard to the, can you repeat the second question?
I can. Whether the development of the medicinal and scientific cannabis market has impacted demand for smallholder grown cannabis.
So at the moment, I wouldn't say that it has impacted the demand for smallholder producers, because the regimes of production, they are quite different. I think it's more technical and scientific, the production for medicinal, scientific, and the industrial purposes. So it's something that is just emerging, and thus far there's no effort, or there's no legal structure or even structural procedure that have been put in place to make the small producer to supply that kind of industry. So small producers produce for personal, for consumption, and the market is also different because this is sold in the rural areas, even in the urban areas. For those who are buying for consumption, but also for ritualistic purposes, also for medicinal purposes within the communities, but not related to the big farmers, big kind of farmer or scientific approaches. So far, these are two different industries, but the question here is, how do you make sure that these small producers who are producing cannabis, is there a way that could be made for them to be able to benefit also from this market that is emerging, and also to be protected by the same rules and the regulations that are protecting agribusiness? So this is the gray area that is there. So in Lesotho, the government has tried to offer some free licenses to small producers alongside those agribusiness that he had to pay for their licenses. But the information that is there so far is that the small producers have not been able to produce. And this hints to the technical and the other standards that are around the issues of production. That is, it's not just producing as if you are producing maize. If you want to produce for medicinal purposes, it is to meet certain grades and all that. There are standards that are there. So this is the picture that is there at the moment.
Thank you. A question that came in quite early on that I'd like to throw open to the panel. It's not directed at any of you in particular, but I think it's related to what Clemence was just saying, in the sense that smallholders becoming more visible and claiming rights. So the question: illicit crop growers barely have identity documents needed to formally obtain a land title or to open a bank account or to get refugee resettlement. One common solution prescribed is to make them more visible. And I think that's something we certainly hear, a lot of what drugs and disorder is about, is raising the voices of people from the marginalized borderlands. But visibility can also be a liability. Invisibility provides some protection. Does anyone have any thoughts on how to manage the trade-offs between visibility and invisibility? I wonder if any of you would like to take that. Go for it, Maritza, you're muted.
Yes, thank you, Karen. I think I just want to raise the point of Amazonian indigenous communities. I think the state and NGOs, and especially environmental NGOs, because these are people key for conservation areas in Peru, have tried to bring their voices out. But if you do that without a strategy of human security, this can create risks, because you spot them in a very risky situation. I think you must bring their voices out. It is important to make them visible, but it is important also, together with this visibility, it must come human security policies, strategies for protection, legal protection, but also police protection. Sometimes when they are, they need to confront foreigners, drug dealers, or other kind of people that want to punish them for being coordinated with NGOs or with the state, or taking places together with state policies. So I think visibility is good, is right, but it needs to come with some kind of human security policy. If not, you are exposing and putting these people in risk.
Yeah, thank you. Would anyone else like to come in on that? Go for it. Oh, Francis first, and then Romain.
I was just going to say quickly that there's, in the debates about the benefits of land formalization, this is a question, because there's different sort of arguments about, sort of inspired by what Bolivia did. There are these arguments that actually formalizing land will help better, administration and better policies and better control of the policies of the sort of cocoa control policies. But I think then when you take this into a context like Colombia, which is so different from Bolivia, it can be quite worrying. And this isn't an argument against land formalization, but like Maritza was saying, this has to be done with caution. So there is a lot of concern from peasants themselves in Colombia that when they formalize their land, then the government knows where they are. They can then take it from them, confiscate it, or persecute them legally more easily if they're visible to the state in that way, such as through land formalization. So there is a risk as well as benefits, just as Maritza said.
Thanks, Francis. Romain, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a very important and dramatic question. At the same time, if you take it from the lens of NGOs, researchers, and civil society, of course, it's kind of a rich, how to say it, like a rich, right? So how much in trouble do you put the people you work with? How much you put them in trouble if you raise awareness about their cases, right? But I think in structural terms, basically having the state treating these people as normal citizens is the key issue, basically. Like NGOs and research is great, the civil society is great, but basically the visibility and the awareness about those peoples is basically, and as Thomas Grisafi, for example, has been working on, is the access to citizenship, basically, and normal citizenship. Those people in different countries, different contexts, in Mexico, for example, they have papers. They belong to indigenous communities and they belong to non-indigenous communities. They belong to regions that are extremely marginalized in many terms, socially, geographically. And at the same time, the state is present there all the time through different manifestations, but mainly through the army, basically, and repression. So it's not a question of being invisible, it's a question of the state grants you certain rights or doesn't grant you any as a citizen in the country. And I think we need more visibility, but it's not only a question of, again, like research projects and NGOs and civil society. It's basically making the state accountable and responsible for providing those people with like proper positive citizenship. And the objective is that, basically, like, of course, protecting our sources, protecting the people who work with the population and all that is fundamental, but it's a research question. It's an NGO problem, basically. But the overarching problem is those people don't have access to proper full citizenship, basically. And I think the protection comes when you do have this access.
Thank you. Clemence, you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, Karen. I just want to quickly comment that in the context of Southern Africa, the issue of land title is not a major issue because it's actually not the predominant form. So we have kind of a dual model, private title for the large scale model and commercial farmers, but in the rural areas, the predominant model of access to land in the rural areas, people don't have title deeds, but it's some kind of a complex kinship relations, and people relating to the land, knowing that, okay, these boundaries are mine, but they don't have access to that. But so the issue, even if you offer titles in that context, especially for most of the small producers, the title would not solve the problem, the issue for them. The issue for them is the national policy around cannabis, which ban and invisibilize the terrain where they are making a livelihood themselves. So as a result, that forced them to go and try to make that kind of a livelihood in the forests where they are hiding. So invisibility. So invisibility starts with the state not recognizing that people can make a livelihood out of cannabis. And as a result, you see that even their fields where they grow their crops, they're also invisible because they have to go and hide it somewhere. No one can see. If you come across it, it's by coincidence. You just bumped it. And even if you come and destroy it, they don't have the power to come and stop you and say, please, because they are afraid that you will report them to the police. So it's a very complex, but I think the title deed is not the main issue, but it's the government policy on agriculture, government policy also on cannabis, and the hope is that with this move towards legalizing medical, scientific, and industrial cannabis, then perhaps space should be found to make sure that those who are also who link to their livelihoods to cannabis, they should be able also to produce within that framework. But as it is right now, like we indicated, it marginalizes their kind of activity. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I think there's another question here from Maritza, which I'd like to take because it's been sitting there for quite a while since the beginning. You said that in the I'm really sorry, my pronunciation is going to be appalling, Huallaga, Coca cultivation and drugs drove the violence of the Sendero, but coca and cocaine seem to have the opposite effect in VRAIM. Why is that? And what can policymakers learn from this experience about the role of illicit economies and security?
Okay, thank you, Karen. I think the main difference is the way in which coca farmers participated in the internal war against Sendero or the insurgents during the 90s. In that context, having Sendero in both areas, the state, perhaps what we can learn is that states sometimes prioritize security, state security, as more important than fulfill anti-drug goals. So during the 90s, the state stopped all eradication in the whole country. They decided that they had to fight first insurgents and not the coca farmers. And that was Fujimori in the 90s. But still, in the north, in the Alto Guayaga, Sendero had more social control on farmers, more relations. They offer more services to the coca growers. And they didn't have, the coca growers didn't have the leadership that they had in the Brian to fight against Sendero. In the Brian, they had since the beginning the initiative to fight against the insurgents, to use coca sellings to buy arms, feed people, form small squadrons to fight with the army against Sendero. So there is a history of alliance between the army and the coca growers in the Brian against insurgents and to build pacification. And they use this history each time that the government want to eradicate the area. While in the other area, in the Alto Guayaga, it was easier, far easier for the army and for the police to criminalize. And that's what Frances, I think, said very beautifully, is the politics of criminalization. You can, in some context, criminalize some people, but the same people is not criminalizing another context because of the different history. So you have these two different areas showing very different results in eradication policy because just ones were more able to avoid criminalization than others. And also they stand today as little kind of defense organizations that keep violence and control. They patrol the communities, and the state and the police is okay with that. So they work together in this pacification of the area while like allowing drug trafficking and coca cultivation going on also in the town. So I think it's interesting how different forms of participation during the war. So I was saying war is no linear consequence for coca farmers. It depends how they engage into the work and how they participate in the results, so they can use that participation in different ways later when they are negotiating with the state in terms of what is going to happen with their crops.
Thank you very much, Maritza. We've got 2 minutes left now, and Romain, I'm going to challenge you to try and do something very fast. Why do you think drug production in Mexico is ignored, and could it potentially be counterproductive to draw attention to it?
I think it's. I think that the question of being counterproductive relates to the former question, and I don't think it's counterproductive. Really, I really don't think so. Why is it so invisible? I think it's a question of a political context. Mexico, if you compare it to most of the countries that are at the top of the list of international cooperation and the question of illicit drugs, basically the countries that you work on at Drugs and Disorder, Myanmar, Afghanistan, Colombia, have been in some way affected by internal armed conflict, right? So you have an issue that makes it internationally important to actually tackle it. Mexico does not and doesn't want to hear from it. The other thing is, in Mexico, it's been routine again, like the way the state has been repressing the production of opium. But right now, for the past 3 years, actually, the current administration, and we've been trying to work on this issue and document it much more, wants to bring a very different perspective in building social programs that should take those farmers out of illicit business. And we have been working on this social program. We will be doing research on it, and the idea is to tell the government, if you're doing this, let's make it more visible so we can evaluate and analyze what's going on in Mexico. But it's a challenge, honestly.
Thank you. You met that particular challenge very well. We're bang on time. Thank you all for absolutely fascinating. Thank you to everybody who asked questions. It was really, really nice to have a discussion with lots of questions. And I will sign off now and leave you in the safe hands, I think, of Jenny. Okay, thank you very much.